I need you to understand something before I tell you what I found in those mountains. For 13 years, search parties combed the Cascade Range looking for Michael Brennan. For 13 years, his family held vigils. His wife never remarried. His daughter grew up with a ghost for a father. The official story says he got lost, succumbed to exposure, and nature took him. That's the comfortable lie. I'm a licensed hunting guide. I've spent 32 years in these forests, and I know the difference between animal tracks and something else. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I have photographs, I have recordings, and I have scars that don't come from any bear or mountain lion. Michael Brennan didn't die in 1995. He made a choice. My name is Robert Dalton. In October of 2008, I was leading a black-tailed deer hunt about 40 miles northwest of Mount Adams in Washington state. 3 clients from Portland, experienced hunters, good men who knew how to handle themselves in the wilderness. We'd set up camp at 7,200 feet in a clearing near Surprise Lake that I'd used dozens of times before. The weather forecast called for clear skies, temperatures in the low 40s during the day, dropping to the 20s at night. Perfect hunting conditions. I'd been guiding in these mountains since I was 23 years old. Took over my father's outfitting business when he retired in '92. I knew these ridges, these valleys, these game trails like some men know city streets. On the 3rd day, October 17th, I woke at 4:30 in the morning to a sound I'd never heard before. Not the bugling of elk, not the distant howl of wolves, not the screech of a mountain lion. This was deeper, more resonant, almost like a horn being blown through a canyon. It echoed off the peaks and died slowly, leaving a silence that felt wrong. My clients were still sleeping. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my rifle and headlamp, and stepped out of the tent. The temperature had dropped more than expected. My breath came out in thick clouds. The stars were so bright they looked close enough to touch, and the moon was 3 days past full, casting everything in silver blue light. I stood there listening for maybe 10 minutes, hearing nothing but the wind moving through the pines. Then it came again, that sound, closer this time, from somewhere northeast of camp, up toward the ridgeline. One of my clients, a dentist named Paul Hoffman, unzipped his tent and joined me. He was carrying his .308 and had that look in his eyes, that mixture of excitement and unease that comes from hearing something your brain can't categorize. He asked me what it was. I told him I didn't know, which was the truth, but I'd been in these mountains long enough to trust my instincts. Something about that sound made the hair on my neck stand up. We decided to wait for dawn. I started coffee on the camp stove, and the other 2 clients emerged, drawn by the smell and the conversation. By 5:45, there was enough light to move safely, so I told them to stay in camp, keep the fire going, and I'd scout ahead to see what we were dealing with. Paul insisted on coming with me. He'd been hunting these mountains for 12 years and knew how to move quietly. I didn't like splitting up, but I also didn't like the idea of leaving 3 guys at camp with no experienced guide if something went wrong. We headed northeast, following a game trail that wound up through old-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock. The forest floor was covered in pine needles and moss, which made for quiet walking, but also meant tracks didn't show well. About half a mile from camp, I found the first sign. A depression in the moss, roughly 18 inches long and 7 inches wide at the ball, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The depth suggested significant weight, probably over 300 pounds. The stride length, when I found the next print 27 feet away, indicated something walking upright. Paul saw it too. He'd hunted enough to know that wasn't a bear track. Bears have a different foot structure, different gait. This was bipedal, humanoid, but far too large. I took photographs with my digital camera, made sure to include my boot for scale. The prints headed upslope toward a dense section of forest where the canopy blocked most of the light. I remember checking my watch. It was 6:23 in the morning. The temperature had risen to maybe 35 degrees. Somewhere above us, a raven called out, that distinctive croak that sounds like laughter. We followed the tracks for another quarter-mile. The terrain got steeper, more difficult. I was breathing hard, my legs burning from the climb. Then Paul grabbed my shoulder and pointed ahead. Through the trees, maybe 60 yards distant, I saw movement. Something large, covered in dark brown hair, moving between the trunks with surprising grace. It was walking upright, definitely bipedal, and it was carrying something in its arms. I raised my rifle, more out of instinct than aggression, and looked through the scope. The magnification brought it closer, and what I saw made my hands start shaking. It was a female. I could tell by the body structure, the prominent breasts visible even through the thick hair covering her torso. She was carrying what looked like an infant, cradled against her chest the way a human mother would hold a baby. Her face was flat, almost human but not quite, with a pronounced brow ridge and a broad, flat nose. She was easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller, with shoulders that would make a linebacker look small. But it wasn't her size that made me freeze. It was the expression on her face. She was looking down at the infant with something I recognized: tenderness, care, love. Paul whispered that we should take the shot. I told him no. I told him to lower his weapon and stay absolutely still. She hadn't seen us yet, or if she had, she didn't perceive us as a threat. She continued moving upslope, disappearing behind a cluster of boulders. I waited 30 seconds, then gestured for Paul to follow me. We moved slowly, carefully, keeping our distance. The tracks led us to an area I'd never explored before, a small valley tucked between 2 ridges, invisible from most angles. The valley was maybe 200 yards across, heavily forested, with a creek running through the center that fed into Surprise Lake below. We positioned ourselves on the eastern ridge, behind a fallen cedar that provided cover. From there, we could see down into the valley. What I saw there changed everything I thought I knew about these mountains. There were 4 of them. The female with the infant, a massive male that had to be close to 9 feet tall and 500 pounds, and 2 juveniles, probably adolescents based on their size and behavior. They were gathered near the creek, and they were doing something I never expected to see. They were cooking, not over a fire, nothing that sophisticated, but they had heated rocks, the kind you'd find near a creek bed, and they were placing them into a hollowed-out log filled with water. Steam was rising from the water. One of the juveniles was adding what looked like roots and plants to the water, while the male was using a sharp rock to scrape meat off what appeared to be a deer carcass. The female with the infant was sitting on a large rock, nursing the baby, watching the others with what I can only describe as maternal supervision. I was so focused on watching them that I almost didn't notice the shelter. It was built into the side of the ridge, partially obscured by overhanging rock and dense vegetation. It looked like a cave entrance that had been modified, expanded, with branches and moss arranged to create a windbreak. And standing in front of that shelter, watching the family below with an expression I couldn't quite read, was a human man. He was thin, almost gaunt, with long grey hair pulled back from his face and a beard that reached his chest. He was wearing what looked like animal skins, crudely stitched together, and his feet were wrapped in some kind of hide. His skin was weathered, deeply tanned, with scars visible on his arms and face. He was holding a walking stick, hand-carved from a branch, and he was just standing there, watching the family the way a father watches his children play in the backyard. Paul started to raise his rifle again. I put my hand on the barrel and pushed it down. The man below hadn't seen us yet, and I needed to think. This couldn't be Michael Brennan. Michael Brennan had been a 34-year-old software engineer from Seattle when he disappeared. He'd been hiking the Pacific Crest Trail section near Mount Adams and never returned. His backpack was found 2 months later, torn apart, scattered across a hillside. Everyone assumed he'd been killed by a bear or a mountain lion. This man looked like he'd been living wild for decades. But then he moved, stepped out from the shelter into better light, and I saw his face more clearly. I'd studied the missing person posters, seen the photographs. The bone structure was right. The nose, the set of the eyes. He was older, transformed by years of exposure and survival, but it was him. It was Michael Brennan, and he was living with them. I must have made a sound, some involuntary gasp or movement, because the male suddenly stood upright, turned, and looked directly at our position. His eyes locked onto mine from across the valley, and I felt something I'd never felt while hunting. I felt like prey. He was easily 100 yards away, but I could see the intelligence in his eyes, the assessment. He made a low sound, somewhere between a growl and a vocalization, and the female immediately scooped up the infant and moved toward the shelter. The juveniles stopped what they were doing and looked in our direction. Michael Brennan turned and saw us too. For maybe 3 seconds we made eye contact. His expression went through a series of changes: shock, recognition, fear, and then something else, something that looked like resignation. He raised one hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture I understood immediately. "Stop. Don't come closer." Then he turned and spoke to the male. And I swear to you, it wasn't English. It was a series of grunts and clicks, modulated in pitch and rhythm like language. The male responded in kind, never taking his eyes off us. Paul was panicking beside me. He was whispering that we needed to get out of there, that we needed to go get help, call the authorities. But I couldn't move. I was watching Michael Brennan, this man who'd been declared dead 13 years ago, having a conversation with a creature that wasn't supposed to exist. The male made a decision. He gestured to the female and juveniles, and they moved into the shelter. Then he started walking toward us, not running, not charging, but walking with purpose and authority. I told Paul to stay calm, to keep his weapon pointed down but ready. The male stopped about 30 yards from our position, close enough that I could see the details of his face, the scars on his chest and arms, the way his muscles moved under the hair. He was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. He stared at us for a long moment, then made a sound, sharp and commanding. Michael Brennan emerged from the shelter and started walking toward us as well, moving slowly, his hands visible and empty. When he got within 20 feet, he stopped. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, like someone who hadn't used English in years. He said, "Don't shoot." I remember thinking how absurd that was, given everything else about the situation. Here was a man who'd been missing for over a decade, living with creatures from legend, and his first words were about not shooting. I lowered my rifle completely and told Paul to do the same. Then I asked the only question that made sense. I asked him if he was Michael Brennan. He nodded slowly. His eyes were different from the photographs I'd seen. Deeper, older, but also strangely peaceful. He said yes, but that Michael Brennan was someone from a long time ago. He asked if anyone had sent us, if we were looking for him specifically. I told him the truth. We were hunting, we heard sounds, we followed tracks, we found him by accident. He seemed to relax slightly at that, though his posture remained guarded. The male was still watching us, positioned protectively between us and the shelter. I asked Michael what happened, how he ended up here. He looked back at the male, then at me, and said it was a long story. I told him we had time. Paul was practically vibrating beside me, torn between fear and fascination, but he kept quiet. Michael sat down on a rock, keeping that 30-foot distance between us, and started talking. He said he'd been hiking the Pacific Crest Trail in late September of 1995. He was going through a divorce, his company was doing layoffs, and he needed to clear his head. He'd done solo hiking before, considered himself experienced. On September 28th, he was about 5 miles north of his planned campsite when the weather turned. A storm came in fast, bringing heavy rain and dropping temperatures. He tried to set up his tent, but the wind was too strong. He found a rock overhang and took shelter, planning to wait it out. That's when he heard them. Movement in the storm, something large moving through the trees. He thought it was a bear at first, stayed quiet and still. But then he saw them, 2 figures moving upright through the rain, and he realized they weren't bears. They were searching for something, moving with purpose. One of them, the male, found him under the overhang. Michael said he'd never been so terrified in his life. The male was massive, wet hair plastered to his body, eyes reflecting his headlamp like an animal's, but the male didn't attack. He made a sound, a call, and the female joined him. They communicated in those grunts and clicks, gesturing at Michael, at the storm, at something upslope. Then the male did something Michael didn't expect. He reached down, not threatening, and took Michael's pack. The female gestured for Michael to follow. He was hypothermic, exhausted, and scared, but he understood somehow that they were offering help. They led him to their shelter, this same place we were looking at now. Inside, it was dry and surprisingly warm. They had bedding made from moss and pine boughs, and there was evidence of long-term habitation. They gave him space, brought him what looked like dried meat and berries, and left him alone to recover. Michael spent 3 days in that shelter while the storm passed. During that time, he watched them. He saw the family structure, the care they showed each other, the problem-solving and tool use. He saw them grieve when the female delivered a stillborn infant, saw them bury it under rocks with what looked like ceremony. He saw intelligence and emotion that shattered every assumption he'd had about what they were. On the 4th day, the weather cleared. He could have left. The male led him to a ridge where he could see familiar landmarks, pointed the direction back to the trail. But Michael stood there, looking at the world he'd come from, thinking about the divorce papers waiting for him, the job he hated, the apartment he could barely afford. He thought about the 3 days he'd just spent, the peace of it, the simplicity. He made a choice that morning. He turned around and walked back to the shelter. The male understood. There was a moment of what Michael called recognition, an acknowledgement that Michael was choosing to stay. Over the weeks that followed, they taught him how to survive, how to find food, how to move through the forest without leaving traces, how to avoid human contact. He learned their communication, basic at first, but growing more complex over time. He learned that they weren't monsters or animals. They were people, just different people, living by different rules. I asked him about his family, his wife, his daughter. His face changed when I mentioned his daughter. He said she was 8 when he left, would be 21 now. He said that was the hardest part, the only part he regretted. But he couldn't go back. He'd been gone too long, changed too much. And if he went back, if he told anyone where he'd been, what would happen to them? The family that had saved him, accepted him, protected him. They'd be hunted, captured, turned into specimens. The sun was fully up now, probably close to 8 in the morning. The temperature had risen to maybe 45 degrees. I could hear water running in the creek below, birds calling from the trees. Paul was recording everything on his camera phone, hands shaking. I asked Michael what he wanted us to do. Did he want to come back? Did he want us to contact his family? He shook his head. He said he'd made peace with his choice years ago. He asked us to leave, to forget we saw him, to let Michael Brennan stay dead. But I couldn't do that. I had evidence, photographs, a witness. His family deserved to know he was alive. His daughter deserved to know her father hadn't abandoned her, that he'd made an impossible choice, but he was alive. I told him that, and I saw something break in his expression. He said if we told anyone, we'd destroy everything. They'd come with helicopters and guns and tranquilizer darts. They'd tear apart this valley looking for evidence. The family would have to flee, find new territory, and they were old now. The male was maybe 40 years old, ancient for his kind. They couldn't run anymore. I asked him how he knew they were old, how he knew anything about their lifespan. He said he'd been with them for 13 years. He'd seen others, rare encounters with different family groups. He'd seen how they aged, how they cared for their elderly. The female with the infant, she was the male's daughter. Her mate had been killed 2 years ago in a rock slide. She'd come back to her father's territory to raise her baby with protection. The juveniles were the male's youngest offspring, born late in his life. This family, this group, they were all he had, and he was all they had. The male made a sound then, low and warning. Michael stood up immediately. He said we'd been here too long, that we needed to leave now. Other members of the family were returning from foraging, and they wouldn't be as tolerant of human presence. He said if we valued our lives, we'd go back to camp, pack up, and leave this area. We wouldn't come back. We wouldn't tell anyone what we'd seen. Paul was already backing away, eager to put distance between us and the valley, but I couldn't leave it like that. I asked Michael one more question. I asked him if he was happy. He looked at me for a long moment, then back at the shelter where the female was visible in the entrance, holding her infant. He said happiness was the wrong word. He said he was home. Then he turned and walked back down into the valley. We watched him go, this man who'd chosen wilderness over civilization, chosen family over blood. The male waited until Michael was back near the shelter, before turning and following. His gait was confident, protective. I'd seen bears move through these mountains, seen elk and wolves, but nothing moved like this. There was intelligence in every step, awareness in every pause. When they both disappeared into the shelter, the valley became still again, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Paul grabbed my arm. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. He said we needed to go, needed to get back to camp right now. I agreed, but not for the reasons he thought. I needed time to process what I'd just witnessed, needed to think through the implications before making any decisions. We made our way back down the ridge, moving faster than we'd come up, and I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. The way Michael had spoken to the male, the ease of it, the familiarity, the way the male had responded, understood, cooperated. This wasn't captivity, this was partnership. It took us 40 minutes to get back to camp. The other two clients, Jerry and Tom, were sitting by the fire drinking coffee, their rifles leaning against a log. They asked if we'd found what was making the sounds. Paul looked at me, and I could see the question in his eyes. What were we going to tell them? I made a decision in that moment. I said we'd tracked what we thought was a large bear, but it had moved into terrain too dangerous to follow. We'd be breaking camp and moving to a different area. Jerry protested. He'd paid $5,000 for this hunt, and we still had 4 days left. I told him I'd refund half his money, but we were moving. Something in my tone must have convinced him because he didn't argue further. We spent the next 2 hours packing up camp, loading gear onto the horses we'd brought in. Paul was quiet the whole time, mechanically going through the motions. I could see him struggling with the same questions I was wrestling with. By 11 in the morning, we were headed back down the mountain. The trail wound through dense forest, past familiar landmarks. I'd led hunts through this area dozens of times, knew every switchback and stream crossing. But everything looked different now. Every shadow between the trees, every unexplained sound took on new significance. How many times had I walked past them without knowing? How many times had they watched me from cover, deciding I wasn't a threat? We made it back to the trailhead by 4 in the afternoon. The clients loaded their gear into Jerry's truck and Paul pulled me aside. We stood there in the parking area, October wind blowing dead leaves across the gravel, and he asked me what we were going to do. I told him I didn't know yet. He said the video on his phone was grainy, but you could see them. See Michael. It was proof. Real, undeniable proof. I asked him what he thought would happen if he showed that video to anyone. He didn't answer right away. I told him to think it through. Think about the media circus, the researchers, the government agencies. Think about what would happen to that valley, to that family. Think about Michael's daughter, finding out her father was alive but had chosen to stay away. Think about all the lives that would be destroyed by the truth. Paul's hands were shaking when he pulled out his phone. He stared at it for a long moment, then handed it to me. I opened the video file, watched 30 seconds of shaky footage showing the valley, the figures moving near the creek. It was proof. It was everything that cryptozoologists had been searching for. I deleted it. Paul didn't stop me. The clients drove off an hour later. Paul stayed behind. We sat in my truck as the sun went down, heater running, and talked. He asked me how many were out there. I said I didn't know, but based on what Michael had said about other family groups, more than people thought. Enough to maintain a population, but few enough to stay hidden. Paul asked how that was possible. We had satellites, drones, trail cameras everywhere. I told him what I'd learned in 32 years in these mountains. People think the wilderness is small, conquered, mapped. But there are millions of acres of forest in the Pacific Northwest that almost no one ever sees. Valleys without trails, ridges too steep for logging, areas where the terrain itself keeps people out. And these creatures, if they'd survived this long, they'd learned to avoid humans. They were intelligent, adaptive, and they understood the danger we represented. Paul asked what I was going to do. I said I was going to keep Michael's secret. I was going to protect that family the way they'd protected him. Paul nodded slowly. He said he'd never tell anyone either, but he wanted to know why I'd decided to help them. I told him the truth, because Michael was right. If I exposed them, I'd be responsible for their deaths or capture, and I'd seen the way the male looked at his daughter and grandchild. I'd seen the tenderness in that female's face when she nursed her baby. They weren't animals to be studied. They were people trying to survive. We parted ways that night. Paul drove back to Portland, and I drove to my cabin outside of Trout Lake. I didn't sleep well. I kept seeing Michael's face, the way he'd looked when I mentioned his daughter. The regret there, the longing, but also the acceptance. He'd made his choice knowing the cost, and he'd lived with that cost for 13 years. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick on a hunt. I had another group scheduled to go out in 3 days, and I cancelled. I told them there'd been a bear incident, which wasn't entirely a lie, and that area was temporarily closed. Then I spent the next week doing research. I went to the library in White Salmon, looked through newspaper archives from 1995. I found the articles about Michael Brennan's disappearance. His wife Jennifer had given interviews. His daughter Sarah, only 8 years old in the photographs, standing next to her mother at a press conference. I learned that Jennifer had held out hope for 3 years before having Michael declared legally dead. She'd never remarried. Sarah had gone to college at the University of Washington, was studying environmental science. There was a quote from her in an article from 2003, on the 8th anniversary of her father's disappearance. She said she'd grown up hiking the same trails he'd loved, feeling close to him in the mountains. She said she believed he was at peace, wherever he was. That quote stayed with me. She was hiking the same mountains where her father lived. She was studying the environment he'd chosen over civilization. And she had no idea he was alive, watching those same peaks, breathing that same air. Part of me wanted to find her, tell her the truth, but another part, the part that had seen Michael's face, knew that would be the cruelest gift. What could she do with that information except suffer? I went back into those mountains 3 weeks later, not to the same area, but close. I told myself I was scouting for the next season, checking game trails and water sources. But I was really looking for signs, for tracks, for evidence of their presence. I found nothing, which was probably intentional. They knew I'd been there. They knew what I'd seen. They were being more careful now. On the 5th day of that solo trip, I made camp in a clearing about 6 miles from where I'd encountered them. I built a fire, cooked dinner, sat watching the flames. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and my breath came out in clouds. Around midnight, I heard it again. That sound, that deep horn-like call echoing through the canyons. It was distant, coming from somewhere to the north, but it was unmistakable. I didn't go looking for it. I stayed by my fire, listening. The call came 3 more times over the next hour, each time from a slightly different location. They were moving, communicating across distances. I wondered if it was the same family or a different group. I wondered if Michael was out there, listening to the same sounds, understanding the messages in ways I never could. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed about him. In the dream, he was standing on a ridge at sunrise, looking down at 2 worlds. Behind him, the valley where his adopted family lived. Ahead of him, in the distance, the civilization he'd left behind. In the dream, he turned and walked back into the wild without hesitation. When I woke up, I knew I'd made the right choice. I kept guiding hunts through that fall and into the next year. I took clients into the mountains, helped them track elk and deer, taught them about the wilderness. But I never went back to that valley. I marked it in my memory as forbidden territory, a place that existed outside the boundaries of my professional life. Occasionally, clients would ask about Bigfoot sightings, the legends that persisted in these mountains. I'd tell them I'd never seen anything definitive, which was technically true. I'd seen something beyond definition. Paul called me twice that first year. The first time was in December of 2008. He asked if I'd been back, if I'd seen anything else. I told him no, and he seemed relieved. He said he'd been having nightmares, waking up thinking about what we'd witnessed. He said his wife thought he'd been acting strange since the hunt, distant and preoccupied. He hadn't told her anything. He asked if the dreams would ever stop. I told him they wouldn't, but they'd change. They'd become less frightening and more sad. The second call came in March of 2009. Paul said he'd driven up to the Cascade Range, parked at a trailhead, and hiked for 3 hours. He said he needed to prove to himself it had really happened, that he hadn't imagined it. He didn't go to the valley, didn't try to find them, but he stood on a ridge and looked at the mountains and knew they were out there. He said it changed everything for him, the way he saw the world, the way he understood his place in it. He asked if I felt the same. I said yes. Years passed. I kept guiding, kept working those mountains. In 2010, I hired a new assistant guide, a young man named Marcus who'd grown up in these forests. He was good, respectful of the land, and he had an instinct for reading terrain that reminded me of myself at that age. One night, sitting around a campfire with clients asleep in their tents, Marcus asked me if I believed in Bigfoot. I was careful with my answer. I said I believed the wilderness was bigger than people thought, that there were things in these mountains we didn't understand. He nodded and said his grandfather, who'd been a logger in these forests in the 1960s, had told him stories. Stories about finding tracks, hearing sounds, seeing shapes moving through the trees at dawn. His grandfather had said the old-timers knew to leave certain valleys alone, knew there were places where the rules were different. I asked Marcus if he'd ever seen anything himself. He said no, but he'd felt watched sometimes, in remote areas where there shouldn't be anyone for miles. He said it didn't feel threatening, just aware. I told him to trust those instincts, to recognize when the forest was asking for respect and distance. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to decide if I knew more than I was saying. He didn't press, and I appreciated that. In 2011, I read an article online about Sarah Brennan. She'd completed her master's degree in environmental science and was working for a conservation group focused on protecting old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest. The article included a photo of her standing in front of a massive Douglas fir, her hand on the bark, smiling. She looked like Michael, same eyes, same bone structure. The article mentioned that she'd grown up without a father, that he'd disappeared in the mountains she was now fighting to protect. She said it felt like honoring his memory. I wondered if Michael knew what his daughter had become. I wondered if he'd ever caught glimpses of her on one of her field research trips, if he'd watched from cover as she measured trees and catalogued species. The thought of that made my chest tight. A father watching his daughter from the shadows, unable to reveal himself, unable to tell her he was proud. It was the kind of tragedy that didn't have a name. That same year, I started noticing changes in the mountains. More development, more logging roads pushing into previously remote areas. The pressure on wilderness was increasing, and with it, the pressure on anything trying to remain hidden. I found myself thinking about the family more often, wondering if they were still in that valley, or if they'd been forced to move. The male would be in his mid-40s by now, the female in her 30s. The infant would be a toddler, the juveniles would be approaching maturity. In 2012, something happened that brought everything back into sharp focus. A forest fire started in late July, sparked by lightning in the dry timber east of Mount Adams. It burned for 3 weeks, consuming over 40,000 acres before they got it contained. The fire came within 2 miles of the valley where I'd found Michael. I watched the news coverage obsessively, tracking the fire's progress, terrified of what it might reveal. But the winds shifted, pushing the fire east instead of west, and the valley was spared. After the fire was out, I went back into those mountains. The landscape was transformed, acres of blackened trees standing like grave markers. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, mixing with the scent of ash and dead vegetation. I hiked to a ridge where I could look down towards the valley. It was green, untouched, an island of life in a sea of destruction. I stayed there for an hour, watching, hoping for some sign. I saw nothing, but I felt better knowing the valley had survived. I'm 57 years old now. I've been guiding hunts in these mountains for 34 years, and in 2 more years, I'll retire. My son will take over the business, though he'll never know why certain areas are off limits in our maps. I think about Michael Brennan often, about the choice he made. Sometimes I think he was running from something. Other times I think he was running towards something. Maybe it was both. There are moments, usually late at night when I can't sleep, when I question whether I did the right thing. His family never got closure. They never got to bury him, never got answers. But then I think about what those answers would have cost. The media exposure, the scientific expeditions, the eventual capture or killing of the creatures who'd saved him. The destruction of Michael's second life, his second family. No, I made the right choice. Some secrets protect more than they harm. But on October 15th, 2014, 6 years after I found Michael Brennan, everything changed. I got a call from Marcus, my assistant guide. He was breathless, speaking fast. He said there was a team of researchers setting up base camp near Surprise Lake. Environmental scientists doing a comprehensive survey of old-growth forest ecosystems. He'd talked to them, asked what they were studying. They said they were mapping every square mile of a specific watershed, using drone technology and ground surveys. The watershed that included the valley. I felt my stomach drop. I asked Marcus for details. He said the team leader was a woman in her late 20s, and when he heard her name, he thought I'd want to know. Sarah Brennan. Michael's daughter was leading a research expedition into her father's territory. I drove up there that same day. The research camp was extensive. 6 large tents, equipment cases, a satellite uplink. There were 8 people on the team, plus 2 hired packers who'd brought in the gear. I parked my truck at the trailhead and hiked up, arriving just before sunset. Sarah was standing near the main tent, reviewing maps with 2 other researchers. When I saw her up close, the resemblance to Michael was even stronger than in the photographs. She had his eyes, that same intensity, that same way of looking at the world like she was trying to understand it at a molecular level. I introduced myself as a local guide, said I wanted to make sure they knew the terrain and the risks. Sarah shook my hand, and her grip was firm, confident. She said they'd done extensive planning, had permits for the entire area, and would be spending the next 6 weeks conducting surveys. 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, using drones and systematic ground coverage, they'd find the valley. They'd find evidence. And if they found evidence, everything would unravel. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag in my truck, unable to sleep. I kept thinking about the impossibility of the situation. Michael's daughter, unknowingly searching for the place where her father lived. The cruel irony of it made my chest hurt. I thought about approaching Sarah, telling her everything, asking her to redirect the survey. But how could I explain without revealing the truth? And if I revealed the truth, could I trust her to keep it? She was a scientist. Her entire worldview was built on evidence and discovery. The next morning, I hiked into the mountains alone. I needed to warn Michael, needed to give him a chance to move the family before they were discovered. I headed toward the valley, moving fast, not bothering with stealth. When I was half a mile out, I stopped and did something I'd never done before. I cupped my hands around my mouth and made the call, that deep, horn-like sound I'd heard them use. It came out rough, probably wrong, but it was loud enough to carry. I waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. The forest was silent except for the wind in the pines and the distant sound of water. My heart was pounding. I'd never tried to contact them before, never presumed I had the right, but this was different. This was survival. Then I heard movement in the trees ahead, deliberate and unhurried, and the massive male stepped into view. He was older now, his dark hair shot through with silver, his movements slightly stiffer. But he was still formidable, still powerful. He stopped 30 feet away and watched me with those intelligent eyes. I held up my hands, showing I was unarmed, no threat. Then I tried to explain, knowing he might not understand English, but hoping the urgency in my voice would convey meaning. I said researchers were coming, scientists with drones and cameras. They'd be mapping every valley, every ridge. They'd find the shelter, find evidence. I said they needed to leave, needed to move deeper into the wilderness, somewhere beyond the survey boundaries. The male tilted his head, and I saw understanding in his eyes. He made a sound, not aggressive, almost like acknowledgement. Then Michael stepped out from behind a boulder. He looked older too, his hair now completely white, his face deeply lined by sun and wind and time. But he moved with the same quiet confidence I remembered. He approached slowly, stopping about 15 feet away. His voice, when he spoke, was still rough but clearer than before. He said he'd seen the camp, watched them setting up from a distance. He'd recognized Sarah even from far away, though she'd changed so much. He asked if she was happy, if she'd had a good life. The question broke my heart. Here was a father who'd given up everything, asking about the daughter he'd never stopped loving. I told him what I knew, that she'd become an environmental scientist, that she was fighting to protect the forests he loved, that she'd dedicated her career to preserving wilderness, that she'd never married, seemed to pour all her energy into her work, that every article I'd read about her mentioned her father, the man she'd lost in these mountains. Michael's eyes filled with tears when I said that. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected it, but it still hurt to hear. I asked him what he was going to do. He said the family would move, head north into British Columbia, where the wilderness was deeper, less accessible. They'd been preparing for this possibility for years, had cached supplies in remote locations along potential migration routes. The male was old now, maybe 45, but he could still make the journey. The female's child was 5 years old, strong enough to travel. The juveniles were fully grown, capable of protecting the group. They'd survive, find new territory, continue their lives away from human contact. But Michael said he wasn't going with them. He was 63 years old, had lived in the wild for 19 years, and his body was failing. He had arthritis in his hands and knees that made the cold months agonizing. His eyesight was deteriorating to the point where he couldn't see details anymore. And last winter, he'd had chest pains that he knew were his heart giving out. He couldn't make a journey that far, couldn't survive the establishment of a new territory. And there was something else, something he needed to do before he died. He needed to see Sarah. Not to reveal himself, not to burden her with the truth, but just to see her up close one more time, to watch her work, to see the woman she'd become, to have one moment where he was near his daughter, even if she never knew. I started to argue, to tell him it was too dangerous, but he cut me off. He said he'd made his choice 19 years ago, and he'd lived with the consequences. Now he was making another choice, and I needed to respect it. We stood there in the morning light, two men who'd been changed by the same impossible encounter. The forest around us was alive with bird calls and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I asked him what he wanted me to do. He said to keep Sarah safe, to make sure she didn't get hurt in these mountains, to guide her away from the valley, give the family time to clear out and erase their presence. And if something happened to him, if his heart gave out or he got injured, I was to make sure his body was never found. He didn't want Sarah to have to bury him. He wanted her to keep believing he'd died quickly, 19 years ago, without suffering. The male made a sound then, low and mournful. Michael turned and went to him, and they stood close together. The male put one massive hand on Michael's shoulder, and Michael gripped the male's forearm. It was goodbye. After 19 years of living as family, they were separating. I saw grief in both their faces, saw the weight of what they were losing. The male vocalized something complex, modulated tones that sounded like language, and Michael responded in kind. Their bond was real, deep, transcending species. The male made another sound, this one directed at me. It sounded like a warning or maybe a request. Take care of him. Michael came back to where I stood. He asked if I'd help him get close to the research camp, find a position where he could watch without being seen. I agreed, though every instinct told me it was a mistake. We spent the next hour working our way around the camp's perimeter, finding a spot on a ridge about 200 yards away that provided a clear view through the trees. Michael settled in behind a fallen log, using his crude binoculars, pieces of glass he'd ground and set in a wooden frame over years of patient work. From there, he could see the camp clearly, could watch Sarah move through her day. I stayed with him. I told myself it was to make sure he didn't do anything reckless, but really, I couldn't leave him alone. We watched Sarah work. She was methodical, organized, clearly the leader of her team. She had her father's intensity, his focus. She moved with purpose, checking equipment, reviewing data, coordinating with her colleagues. At one point, she laughed at something one of her colleagues said, and the sound carried across the distance. Michael's hands shook when he heard it. He said it was the first time he'd heard her laugh since she was 8 years old. He said he'd forgotten the sound of it, and now he'd remember it forever. We stayed there for 3 days. I told my son I was scouting new territory, checking trails for the upcoming season. Marcus covered my scheduled hunts without question. Michael and I took turns watching the camp, sleeping in shifts. During the long hours, he told me more about his life with the family, how they'd taught him to find edible plants, to identify which roots were safe and which were poison, how to read weather patterns in the behavior of animals and the color of the sky, how to move through the forest without leaving traces, stepping on rocks and hard ground, avoiding soft earth. He told me how they communicated not just with sounds, but with gestures and expressions, how a tilt of the head meant one thing, a particular hand movement meant another, how they mourned their dead with ceremony, covering bodies with stones and standing vigil for days, how they celebrated births with vocalizations that echoed through the valleys, how they had conflicts and made peace, how they established hierarchy and maintained it through displays rather than violence. He told me about the stillborn infant he'd helped bury, how the female had wailed for hours, how the male had sat with her in silence, about the juveniles he'd watched grow to adulthood, teaching them to fish in the creek and identify animal tracks, about the harsh winters where they'd huddled together for warmth in the shelter, sharing body heat to survive temperatures that dropped below zero, about the first time the male trusted him enough to leave him alone with the female and infant, a gesture that meant he'd been accepted as family. He told me about the day one of the juveniles brought him a gift, a perfect piece of quartz crystal found in a stream bed, about how they'd sit together in the evenings, grooming each other's hair, removing parasites and debris, strengthening bonds through touch, about learning that family wasn't about blood or species. It was about who stood with you when the storms came, who shared their food when resources were scarce, who kept watch while you slept. On the third day, Sarah announced to her team that they'd be doing a drone survey of the northern watershed the next morning. The valley was in that survey area. Michael heard it, even from our distance. He turned to me and said it was time. The family would be gone by now, would have erased their presence as much as possible. But there might still be evidence, things they couldn't carry or destroy, markings on trees, paths worn into the ground by decades of use, modified rocks that served purposes only visible to those who knew what to look for. He needed to make sure. That night, under a half moon, Michael and I hiked to the valley. The temperature had dropped to maybe 30 degrees, and our breath came out in clouds. The forest was quiet, that deep silence that comes after dark in remote wilderness. We used headlamps sparingly, trusting our knowledge of the terrain. When we reached the valley, it was empty. The shelter had been dismantled, the rocks scattered to look natural. The fire pit had been buried deep, covered with soil and leaves. The paths they'd worn through the vegetation had been covered with branches and dead fall. To an untrained eye, it would look like any other wilderness valley. But I could see the signs. The family had been here for decades, maybe longer. The male's father had probably used this valley, maybe his grandfather too. You couldn't erase that completely. There were trees with bark stripped at a height too high for bears. Rocks arranged in patterns that seemed random but weren't. Scratches on boulders that marked territory boundaries. Michael moved through the valley like a ghost, checking every area, removing any evidence we found. A bone tool left behind, too sophisticated to be natural. Edges worked smooth for cutting. A pile of sorted stones they'd used for heating water, each one a specific size and shape. Fibers from plant materials they'd processed, distinctive in their uniform length. He worked through the night with methodical care, and I helped him, carrying debris away and scattering it far from the valley. By dawn, the valley looked pristine. Sarah's drones would find nothing but wilderness. The creek ran clear over its rocky bed. The pines swayed in the morning breeze. There was no evidence that anything beyond deer and elk had ever lived here. As the sun rose, Michael sat down on the rock where I'd first seen the female nursing her infant. He looked exhausted, his face grey, lips slightly blue. He put his hand on his chest and breathed slowly, deliberately, like each breath required conscious effort. I asked if he was okay. He said his heart was struggling, had been for months. Every beat felt irregular, painful. He said it was time for him to rest. I realized what he meant, what he was asking. I told him no, that I could get him out of the mountains, get him medical care. He could see Sarah, could tell her the truth, could have time with her. We could figure out how to protect the family while giving him a chance at more life. But he shook his head. He said he was dying anyway, that his heart was too damaged. Years of exposure, inadequate nutrition, the stress of survival had taken their toll. He'd rather die here, in this valley, where he'd been happy. He'd rather Sarah never know what he'd become. Rather she remember him as he was. And he'd rather not burden her with the impossible choice of whether to expose the family's existence to protect them or to reveal them to science. I sat down next to him. We watched the sunrise together, the light turning the peaks gold, illuminating the valley in that perfect early morning glow that makes everything look new. Michael said this was where he'd made the most important decision of his life, and this was where he wanted it to end. He said the valley had given him 19 years of peace, of purpose, of belonging. He couldn't ask for more than that. He asked me to promise him something. After he died, I was to bury him deep, cover the grave completely, leave no trace. Sarah's survey would pass through this valley, find nothing, and move on. The family would be safe in their new territory. His daughter would continue her work protecting wilderness, never knowing she was protecting the creatures who'd protected her father. And he would rest in the place he'd chosen as home. His breathing got shallower as we sat there. I held his hand, this man I'd known for less than a week total, but who'd changed my understanding of everything. He said thank you, said he was grateful I'd kept his secret, grateful I'd let him see Sarah one last time. Then he said something that broke me. He said to tell Sarah someday when I was old, and it didn't matter anymore, that her father had loved her, that he'd thought about her every day, that his biggest regret was leaving her, but his biggest comfort was knowing she'd grown into someone remarkable, someone who fought for what she believed in, someone who protected the wild places because she understood their value. Michael Brennan died at 6:47 in the morning on October 18th, 2014. The sun was fully up, the valley was beautiful, and his last words were about his daughter. I sat with him for an hour, making sure he was really gone, saying my own goodbye to a man who'd shown me that family could transcend everything we thought we knew. Then I did what he'd asked. I buried him deep, in a spot where the ground was soft enough to dig, but rocky enough that animals wouldn't disturb it. It took me 3 hours, working with a flat rock as a shovel. I placed him facing east, toward the sunrise, the way he'd been facing when he died. I covered the grave with stones, then covered the stones with moss and leaves and pine needles. By the time I was done, you couldn't tell anyone had ever been there. The forest had claimed him completely. I hiked out of the valley as Sarah's team was launching their first drone. I watched from a distance as it flew over the area, its camera capturing nothing but forest and creek and stone. The survey took 2 more weeks. They found evidence of black bear, elk, deer, mountain lion. They documented tree species and water quality and soil composition. They measured biodiversity and mapped terrain. They found no trace of Michael Brennan or the family he'd lived with. Sarah wrote a paper about the biodiversity of the watershed, published it in a conservation journal. In it, she dedicated her work to her father's memory, to the man who'd taught her to love these mountains before he was lost to them. Paul called me when he heard about the survey. He'd been following Sarah's career too, reading her papers, tracking her work. He asked if I'd been worried, if the survey had found anything. I told him it had been handled. He didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer them. Some burdens are meant to be carried alone. But I heard relief in his voice, and something else, sadness. We'd both been changed by what we'd seen, both been carrying the weight of it for years. I retired in 2016, 2 years after Michael died. My son took over the guiding business, and I moved to a small house in Trout Lake. I spend my days reading, gardening, watching the mountains from my porch. But once a month, I hike into the wilderness. Sometimes I go to the valley where Michael is buried. Sometimes I just go deep, listening for sounds that might be them, the family that raised him and mourned him. I've never seen them again. I don't know if they're still in British Columbia or if they've moved further north, maybe into the Yukon or Alaska. I don't know if the old male is still alive or if he passed peacefully, surrounded by his family. I don't know if the female's child has grown up strong, maybe started a family of their own. I don't know if they remember Michael the way I do, if they have ways of honoring their dead that I never learned about. But I like to think they're out there somewhere, living their lives in some remote valley, still teaching their children to avoid humans, still maintaining the secrets that keep them safe. Sarah Brennan is 37 years old now. She's become one of the leading voices in wilderness conservation in the Pacific Northwest. She's fought against logging operations, pushed for expanded wilderness protections, worked to create wildlife corridors that allow animals to move safely through human-modified landscapes. Every piece of wilderness she saves is a piece where the family might live safely. She doesn't know that, can't know that, but it's true nonetheless. Her father's legacy lives on through her work, protecting the very creatures who gave him a second life. I think about telling her sometimes. I'm 70 years old now. Whatever consequences might come from revealing the truth, I won't live long enough to see most of them. But every time I consider it, I remember Michael's face when he asked me to keep his secret. I remember the male's hand on his shoulder, that gesture of family and farewell. I remember the promise I made to let Sarah believe her father died quickly, without suffering, 19 years ago. Some stories don't have clean endings. Some truths do more harm than good. Michael Brennan made a choice in 1995 to walk away from civilization and into legend. He lived 19 years as part of something most people believe is impossible. He died in the place he called home, surrounded by the beauty he'd chosen over comfort. And his daughter lives on, fighting to protect the wilderness that protected him, never knowing the full truth of her impact. I kept his secret. I'll keep it until I die. And maybe that's the real story here. Not that Bigfoot exists, not that a man chose to live with them, but that sometimes the greatest act of love is protecting someone from a truth they don't need to bear. Sarah Brennan lost her father in 1995, but she gained a purpose, a mission, a way to honor his memory that's made a real difference in the world. If she knew the truth, all of that would be complicated by questions without answers, by moral dilemmas she'd never be able to resolve. The last time I hiked to Michael's grave was 3 months ago, in July of 2024. It's been 10 years since I buried him. The forest has reclaimed the valley completely. There's no sign that humans or anything else ever lived there. I sat on the same rock where he died and thought about all the choices that led to that moment. His choice to stay in 1995, my choice to keep his secret in 2008, his choice to die in the valley rather than reveal himself to Sarah. Were they the right choices? I don't know. I know they were made with love, with the intention of protecting others. I know they cost something from everyone involved. Michael never saw his daughter grow up, never got to tell her he was proud, never got to meet her as the woman she became. Sarah never got closure, never got to bury her father, never got answers about what really happened. The family lost a member who'd become one of them, who'd brought human knowledge and perspective to their lives. And I've carried the weight of this secret for 16 years, will carry it until I'm gone. But I also know this. Somewhere in these mountains, or maybe further north, there are creatures living free because a man decided their lives mattered more than his own comfort. There's a woman fighting to protect wilderness because she believes it took her father, not knowing he chose it and it chose him back. There's a family that might still be out there, teaching their children ancient ways of survival, continuing a lineage that existed long before humans built cities and created civilization. The world thinks Michael Brennan died in 1995, lost to the wilderness, another tragedy in the long history of people who went into the mountains and never came back. But I know different. Michael Brennan found something in those mountains that most people never find in a lifetime. He found belonging, he found family, he found peace. And when his time came, he died protecting both families, the one he was born into and the one he chose. That's not a tragedy. That's a life fully lived, on his own terms, by his own choices. And every time I look at these mountains, every time I hear the wind through the trees or see the peaks at sunrise, I remember him. I remember them all, and I keep my promises. Some secrets are meant to be buried deep, where only the mountains know the truth. This is one of them. I'm 70 years old, and when I'm gone, this story dies with me. Unless, someday, when Sarah Brennan is old herself, and the world has changed in ways I can't predict, someone decides she deserves to know. But that's not my choice to make anymore. I've carried this as far as I can. I made a promise to a dying man in a wilderness valley, and I've kept it. That's all any of us can do in the end. Keep our promises, protect the ones who need protecting, and let the mountains keep their secrets. Michael Brennan is at peace. The family is free. Sarah is doing work that matters. And I can live with the weight of knowing what really happened in those mountains. That's my story. That's the truth about the hiker who went missing in 1995 and the hunter who found him in 2008. Make of it what you will. Believe it or don't. But know this. There are things in these mountains that defy explanation. Families that exist outside our understanding, and choices that echo through decades. I've seen it with my own eyes, lived with it for 16 years, and I'd make the same choices again. The mountains keep their secrets, and so do I.